Hi everyone, it's Obi Abuchi here with the Leading from Your Core podcast and Vodcast. This show is dedicated to helping leaders all around the world discover leadership wisdom, stories, and insights that will enable you tap into the power of leading from the inside out. And I'm delighted to welcome onto the show Wendy Cartwright. Wendy, great to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me. Looking forward to it.
So am I. And so that people get to know you, Wendy has held senior HR roles in central government, financial services, energy and retail sectors, and now has a portfolio that includes a mixture of project and non-executive roles. And she's particularly interested in major projects that involve creating high-performing organizations with a focus on diversity and inclusion and employee engagement and well-being. Really important topics close to my heart, certainly. Wendy, once again, really exciting to have you on the show.
Thank you.
And people are always curious about the guests, especially if they don't know you. And I've given a bit of an intro, but it would be useful to hear from you. Just share a little bit about your journey, particularly as a leader. I'd love to just hear a bit about your career journey and what you enjoy most about being a leader as a way of kicking things off.
Oh gosh. So I actually, it's really interesting, isn't it, sometimes to reflect on where you get your foundations from. I know that's a theme that you talk about a lot. Yeah. And I started off in retail, and I think that people that I know that have started in retail, you get a really good grounding in customer interaction, the way that business works, and so on and so on. And I think also for me, that certainly in my earlier career, that kind of chimed with I'm fairly action oriented. I quite like to see decisions done and implemented and so on. So starting off in the private sector, and then obviously I think as you grow, it's an interesting journey to go on, where you need to be perhaps more reflective and more strategic as you kind of grow and develop. And in my career, I've been, as you introduced me, Obi, that so HR, people management, is my kind of core. That's what I do. Mm-hmm. But I've, as you say, worked in multiple sectors. I've worked in quite complicated environments and been involved in some really interesting things. And I think that what I've appreciated, I suppose, the opportunities that's given me to learn about different contexts, to learn about different organizations, but to apply some of the things that you learned right in the very beginning, how that gets adapted as you go. And latterly, I've been doing a lot of stuff. I'm very fortunate, I think, in that I really love doing stuff where I think I can add value and where I learn something. So those are my, am I really interested in a thing?
Sure.
Where can I add value, and where can I learn? And the kind of major programs environment is what I've been doing, but with some bits and pieces added into the portfolio. Mm-hmm.
Brilliant. And I didn't get to say this, but you were a fellow of the CIPD. You've now been made a companion of the CIPD. So for those that don't know, here in the UK, that's the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. And so people development and people management, as you have said, is your thing. And that's quite a recognition. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And you were the former HR director for the Olympic Development Authority. So you've seen a lot in government and the financial services, energy. You've seen and worked with lots of leaders. You're aware of a lot of the challenges today. What would you say are some of the most significant challenges that leaders are facing in our world today?
Yeah, it's really interesting, I think. So I think that the kind of so the post-Brexit, post-COVID, how are we coming into this new landscape, coupled with the environmental crisis, how do we get to carbon net zero, et cetera, et cetera. I think that those are really important challenges across the piece, regardless of whether or not you're public, private sector, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that reflecting on the past couple of years, and you'll have had these conversations, Obi, I'm sure, multiple times, but I think one of the things that struck me is that a lot of organizations had been previously in control of their organizations to a greater extent than they have been, you know, they've been forced to recognize, you know, it's always been about, you know, you can't necessarily influence what your competitors are doing, but you've got a good idea of what's happening. You've got a good control over your landscape. You can make decisions and implement them. And I think, you know, even if you just take, for example, in the UK, but broadly as well, across the world, skills shortages, challenges with supply chains, you know, et cetera, and then couple that with what had previously, pre-COVID, been the real challenge of getting to carbon net zero and how we're going to change. So I think that across the piece, there are enormous challenges around skills development, holding on to people. What does this new hybrid working look like then? Coupled with some really interesting challenges around, which I think have been growing anyway over previous years, around what does leadership really look like? And I know, again, that's something that you focus on. For many years, the kind of traditional, more, you know, do as I say kind of leadership hasn't worked. But what does it really mean around sort of challenges for leadership as we lead out of this crisis mode and into something over the next few years, which feels a little bit more stable and a little bit more in control. So I think that's a real challenge. And some of the responses to the COVID crisis have actually given some things that I know that businesses want to hold on to. So what does it mean about, you know, how flexible can and should you be in your organization around kind of giving people, your employees, control over their time and space and all of those sorts of things. And I think that there's some interesting sort of dynamics at play here, probably uniquely at play with all of those things coming together.
Yeah. There's thanks for that. So yeah, lots of big things coming out of this post-COVID, post us, the UK, post-Brexit era, and the skills shortages, massive challenge for leaders. And as you say, recognizing what do we actually have control over and what do we not have control over, and the things that we thought we had control over, was that just an illusion? In reality, we're realizing we don't have control over those things, and therefore that is testing us as leaders. It's testing our perspective, it's testing our resilience. And I'm sure you've had conversations with lots of leaders who over the COVID period were tested more than ever and stretched more than ever to think differently. And not only were they having to manage the operational and business side of things, all of us were dealing with personal challenges as well, and family health challenges, making sure that we're at our best. And so that's a huge amount of pressure and stress on leaders and resilience. So that's an important topic that I often focus on with leaders, has been tested and stretched. And I'd love to just go there with you now in terms of what part does resilience play in some of what leaders are having to navigate right now, and how can leaders tap into more of that resilience? So yeah, let's just go there. But what role do you think resilience is playing for leaders today, and how can they tap into more of that?
I think it's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because and in advance of this conversation, Obi, you asked me to think about resilience, so I did spend some time thinking about that, what it meant to me personally, and what I think it means for leaders at the moment. In some respects, because the COVID situation has been, I mean, and it's awful what a lot of people have gone through personally, and you know, as in globally, there's been an enormous shock, and a lot of that's going to carry on for, you know, years and years and years. So so there's a serious impact on people's mental health and well-being because of COVID. And sometimes that is felt, as you quite rightly said, on a very personal level, and sometimes it's felt in organisations in health and social care and so on in different ways. So there is something about that, and again, reflecting on what that feels like, I think, you know, from my perspective, you know, I've got a daughter who's in her early 20s, and I, you know, having the conversations with her around, like, the world is not, you can't control everything. And here, and actually a whole generation have gone through something where they've actually gone through something that has been really, really difficult, and they've come out of the other end. It feels a little bit like they're going through the Second World War or the First World War to me. I think there's something around that kind of reminds us of our resilience as human beings, individually and collectively. So I think that is going to play out in interesting ways anyway. And I think organisationally, the recognition of that, and from a, you know, how I've seen some individuals change how they show potentially, let's say, a bit more vulnerability. They don't have all the answers, you know, et cetera. I think that's quite, it will be interesting to see how much of that sort of settles down into a different way of thinking as we go forward. But on a kind of personal level as well, you know, leaders, and, you know, this goes to exactly to what you're teaching. You've got to have your own core has to be right. You have to look after yourself first, so that you can do the right things by your family, by your organizations, and so on and so on. And I think that whole thing about paying attention to the whole self, doing some, you know, getting into good habits, works on an individual as well as a team, as well as an organization, and then societal level, if you like. And so, you know, if you think about conversations around mental health, around diversity, you know, the aftershock of George Floyd, and the conversations that are now opening up and we're thinking about, you know, in diversity and inclusion terms, the impacts of empire in a way that we hadn't done before. So it's a learning, you know, for me, that's been a real learning point. And so I think that there's a whole, so the question about remaining open, remaining, you know, in a sort of learning mindset, and but also kind of banking the things that can anchor us a little bit, so that we don't feel too buffeted. I think that's the sort of sweet spot, if we can get there.
Sure, yeah. Because I can imagine that for a lot of people, you talked about the vulnerability that leaders had to show during, especially over the last 18 months, because there really weren't answers to a lot of questions that people had. There was a lot of uncertainty. You're not the first person that's spoken about the similarities to wartime, not only from a rationing perspective, here in the UK, from toilet roll to going into the supermarkets and being told, hey, only take 2 packs of or 4 packs of pasta and tins. And so that really felt, whoa, what's going on here? As well as just the uncertainty of lockdown and impact that was going to have, and how do we connect as an organization digitally. So there was a level of vulnerability that everyone felt. And I can imagine that leaders, I know for sure, I've had lots of conversations with leaders who felt that too. You talked about this anchoring, and I often talk about it as, you know, just really having a strong core, having something that grounds you, and anchoring so that you're not buffeted and too much by all of this uncertainty, because that's really hard. As leaders, we want to know where we're going and we want to know what we're about. What specifically have you seen work really well to anchor leaders? So as they're asking new questions and exploring a new world, these are some of the things that keep you anchored. What have you seen work well and perhaps not so well?
Yeah, so I think, so from a sort of organizational perspective, it's all about understanding your purpose, the direction you're going in. Are you all, moving in that direction? The kind of communication across that, trust in relationships, which can take some time to build, and the challenges that have recently posed themselves around. We've all been, who would have imagined that 2 years ago? We've all been hiring people sometimes into our senior teams that we haven't met face to face. And how does that look like? What does that look like? How do you create those kind of personal connections? You can't spot, for example, when you might otherwise metaphorically have put an arm around a colleague in an office and said, "Are you okay?" for example. Sure. So some of those things I think that we've all worked our way through, and we know that, again, from the pandemic perspective, I think that the analogy, again, if we can just kind of continue to think about that a little bit longer before we move off of the pandemic, the analogy in the beginning is we're all in the same boat. We know that's not true. We know that the pandemic has caused real schisms in people that have not had access to technology to be able to study or work. People that are working from a bedroom. People who I've always, when people have said to me, "How are you doing?" I'm like, well, I'm really lucky because I've got space in my house and I've got a garden and I can go outside and I can do those things. And that has not been everybody's experience. Yeah. And so I think that from a kind of, sort of resilience perspective, again, that whole thing about mental health and being able to perform at your best, there's, some of the things that we've learned and possibly reinforced over the pandemic. Some people have, it's about appreciating open space. It's about getting out early in the morning. And all of that is actually rooted in scientific. It's how our brains are wired. It's how how we process, good nutrition leads to, your better gut health leads to all of that sort of thing. So I think that the whole thing about focusing a little bit more on that, there's much more information out there now. And I think from an organizational perspective, moving away from well-being, feeling like, you get a fruit basket on a Tuesday. And we do a well-being week once a year. Doesn't feel right anymore. So what does that look like? And there's a lot of things that you can and should do from an organizational perspective to do it. But I think it's again, from my perspective, it's about, how do you continue to create, organizations have been awful at this for, most organizations have been awful at this for years. It's about the voice that goes up from the organization up. We all do a little bit too much top down. So I think that, again, creating those for, getting really good at communications. And interestingly, again, in the beginning of the pandemic, organizations were getting better scores on engagement and, feeling connected and leadership and the comms than they had previously.
Sure, yeah.
I think that's starting to wane a bit more now. And I don't think there are easy answers to that.
It's interesting, just hearing the description, and I'm glad that you said, hey, let's just dig deeper into the impact of the pandemic and some of what it taught us. I remember saying to various people that I'd work with that it's surprising to me how, and I'd say this to any senior leadership team, how typically most leadership teams seem to want to leave humanity at the door and think, hey, we've got to focus on, here's what we got to do, here's what we got to deliver. And what COVID did in a very sobering way, but a helpful way, brought that humanity back. It brought the humanity back in various ways, whether that's, hey, my kid is running in the background, or he might come in and say he needs help with the homework, and we're all feeling Yeah, I get it. I get it, because this is unusual times, but all of a sudden you realize, I am vulnerable. I'm needy. My family is needy. This is, extra pressure on all of us. And so in connecting with more of our humanity, we're able to say, how are people doing? Let's share, let's be transparent, let's have weekly updates so that people know. So somehow COVID helped us be more human, and that helped us deal with some of the sort of mental health challenges. And how do we as leaders going forward make sure we keep that humanity, and don't suddenly say, oh, okay, yeah, the world's better again, great, let's become robots and do it. I'm like, no, let's remain human and stay connected to that. So that's what just hearing you share there draws out for me, just the importance of connecting to our, not losing sense of our humanity as we try to grow and build and develop our organizations.
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things I guess this also draws out as well, you talked about some of the sort of top-down approach to engagement and communication and leadership, is about how leaders see their influence and use their power. How do leaders see the power that they have? And sadly, we've got examples of leaders who abuse that power and authority. I'm curious, just from your experience, your perspective, why do you think that is? Why is it that leaders abuse the power and authority that they have?
Oh gosh, that's a big question.
I know, we can put the world to rights here. That's allowed.
There's something, isn't there? I wish I'd have had a chance to look up the statistic, Obi, but there's something about the proportion of senior leaders that are potentially on the psychopath scale, which is interesting, where there's a kind of lack of empathy. And it is a thing, it's a thing, it's not a violent psychopath, but actually that disconnect with empathy and kind of like the narcissistic tendencies and so on and so on. And there's definitely something around the kind of ambition. And one of your sort of thoughts I know that we might talk about is that whole question of ego and self and all of that as a leader. So I think that there's, well, let's sort of unpack that. I think, why do people behave like that? It's because they're allowed to or encouraged to.
Sure.
It's and some of that is in our biases. We see people that look like that. We think that's what they have to look like. We think that you have to be, a tall man called John to be a CEO. Again, another stat that, I can't remember the numbers, but there are more men called John that were CEOs than women in the FTSE 100 a while back. I'm sure that's still true. So that wow. And actually, there's been, again, studies done on a kind of height differentials. We're all wired to think that a leader looks like a certain thing. And then I think that some of that can also lead into behaviors where, and again, from a really early grounding, I think, and this is something that fascinates me as well, we can all do more in this area. There's, from a gender bias perspective, if we're going to go into that route, there's something that reinforces for young boys and young men, and then men in organizations, that you have to be tough and strong and resilient, and you have to be, behave in a certain way.
Sure.
And you still go into shops now, and the girl's t-shirt says little princess or sweet, or I'm cute, and the boys one goes, I'm a superhero, I'm a astronaut, I'm a feisty,
I can take on the world. Yeah.
and it happens from a really early age, that conditioning. So I think it's unsurprising when society conditions still like that, that the assumptions that get then placed on leadership behaviors also go into that area. So I think that there's something societal around it, which we should challenge. And I know, again, good leaders do, and we all learn about those things. I think in certain organizations, the kind of more kind of aggressive, if you think back to some of the awful examples where business have in the end gone bust, or they've, there's multiples of those, it's because all the way through that leaderism is seen as, decisive, able to cut through stuff, make a thing happen, etc. So, and there's not enough checks and balances in the machinery to stop that. So I think that because we've had quite a lot of those examples now, the organizations focus on the ESG thing, environmental, social, and governance is right. But what we see is that some organizations are paying lip service to it and don't really mean it. So, and again, if you think back to some of the kind of organizational responses or things that went out PR wise from, post George Floyd, if you like, just to take that as an example, that felt really like doesn't really stack up, the greenwashing environment as well, and so on and so on. So there's something around organizational truth, being held to account, and, being authentic in inverted commas, that, really needs to exist within an organization. And again, the more diverse, the more, able an organization is to critically challenge itself, to look outside, to bring in external perspectives. It stops the groupthink that you otherwise get. So I think that I'd say all of those things are true. And the focus on diversity and inclusion and different, we have to make sure that within organizations we are really truly open to that, because if you're the one person in the room that's trying to challenge something, or maybe you don't even speak up, or maybe how do we create that? How do we ensure when we're leaders that as we go around the table in a meeting or a virtual table, that we ask people that wouldn't otherwise be the loudest voice, that we challenge our own thinking to make sure that we've not gone down an unchecked path. And I think those are all good things to do. That's
you talked about authenticity there as organizations, but also as a leader, and it feels in a strange way it actually takes an incredible amount of confidence and security to draw on more ideas as a leader, which might seem odd to some people, because you think, but it's the confidence to cut through and it's the confidence to deliver. But you're saying, and I certainly say, actually, if you're really confident, you're really secure, you'll ask people the questions. You won't allow groupthink in your leadership team. You'll say, hey, who's got a different perspective, guys? Because we're about our purpose here. And it's not about me looking good or me being right. It's about us doing the right thing. So it takes a lot of confidence in, a real authentic confidence as a leader to say, I don't have all the answers, and I'm going to make sure that as a team, we're really drawing on the talent and the diversity of thinking and perspective to achieve what we need to achieve. But then that brings us to something else that you touched on, of just about ego, but also as leaders, we're often where we are because we're seen as decisive and know what we need to do. And so managing that ego and how I look and how I come across is a tough thing to do. And what helps leaders to keep their ego in check? What's been some of your experience of, hey, I need to keep my ego in check here and really be in service of the organization rather than just myself?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because you do need to have a certain degree of self-belief and a certain degree of confidence. And in some respects, it's really interesting to think about whether or not you go into the fake it till you make it mode, in which case, and because, and again, before our conversation, I was reflecting on my own kind of journey, if you like, as a leader. I think every single time that I've gone a little bit up the ladder or done something which is a little bit more challenging, there's a moment of discomfort that you have to kind of embrace before you do the next thing, or as you go into it, you think you've got it nailed and you haven't really. And then you have a moment of realization that, you know, where somebody says to you, no, actually, you know, you're just doing this adequately. There's this whole thing over there that you're not even looking at. And you go, oh no. And then you have to embrace it, and then you have to go for it. So I think that if you've gone through that, in some respects, it sort of checks your ego, but it sort of helps you kind of move, if you like. So both of those things, I think, have to be true. You know, you have to have the confidence. And again, going back to, and I know I'm gender stereotyping here, but forgive me, you know, typically it can be more of a female trait, typically, to hold back and to need more encouragement and to be told, no, you go for this job now. And it can typically be more of a male trait. I'm just like in broad generalization.
Yeah, sure.
Studies have been done on that says that men are more likely to put themselves into positions where they feel more confident to do stuff, even if they don't have all of the tools in their bag. You know, even if there's a little bit of a gap in a job description, and women are less likely to do that and need more encouragement in doing that. So I think, and that applies to, you know, other groups that typically aren't in leadership positions as well. So I think there's something around that. And I think that it's if you're the values of an organization, I think that's a really interesting question as well, because there will be some organizations that, you know, really you would be selling your soul if you actually went along with the way that, and people get stuck in organizations for all sorts of reasons, so I'm not judging that at all, but there'll be moments where, you know, you're thinking about applying for a job, or maybe you're in an organization and you've got to feel that the system itself and the people and the way that the organization conducts itself is basically in keeping with your own kind of morals, if you like. Morals and values. So I think that there's a sort of balance between, you have to have sufficient confidence or sufficient support system around you to make you feel comfortable to be in a position of where you are essentially putting yourself a little bit more on the line because you're in a leadership or management position. I think that happens at every level, actually, as you go up, you know, your first line supervisory thing, your, you know, et cetera, that happens at every level. But I think at the top of organizations, and certainly in some sectors, it can be really, really competitive. And I think that's why some people have to have an ego and like a persona. It's almost like an acting thing in some places, where you have a work persona. And maybe, again, back to the conversation about COVID, maybe some of that has been a little bit chipped away. And so that people, there's more of a blend of the human person. But some organizations can be really tough, you know, again, at very top levels, you know, the average length of a CEO is, you know, less than 18 months or something like that in some spheres. So, you know, you don't necessarily judge people for having to look like they're in control of everything.
Indeed, and some of it is the market, right? If every quarter you're having to declare your performance and how you've done, and before you know it, you're out if you haven't delivered. And so no matter how much of a long-term focus you might want to have, or hey, the overall well-being of the organization, if you're being judged by the last quarter and not the last quarter's engagement scores or well-being initiatives, but last quarter's earnings, then that can be really tough for leaders as well, and obviously something that they need to manage. Wendy, I feel we could go on and clearly continue to talk and explore and share ideas and put the world to right, as well as share some incredible tips for our viewers and listeners. But I'd love to wrap up with this question. If you could chat with your younger self, just as you were beginning your leadership journey, with everything that you've seen, everything you've experienced as a leader, what advice would you give to your younger self about the leadership journey ahead? What advice would you give?
Yeah, I think I would say I think there is something about embracing the discomfort that comes, like, you know, that as you go, there'll be moments where, you know, you feel less comfortable. There'll be moments that you feel, you know, maybe you can't see the way forward in your organization. Maybe you need to think about changing and so on. And that's all good. And to sort of pay attention to that. I'm very much a kind of head and heart person. If something doesn't feel right, you think about it and you kind of unpack it and you pay attention to that. And likewise, you know, if you're thinking something, then you check with your gut, does it feel right? And so kind of in some respects, it's sort of trust your instincts and embrace, if you like, how you're feeling, because that is really valuable, and know that at certain points it's going to be a bit tough. And as you say, like the resilience that you've got, if you've got enough chips in the bank, then you're going to get through it. So, you know, so sort of working through that. I think also I'd say that I had various moments in my career where I've kind of learned some important things, I think, about myself and about, you know, my I suppose potential, but also how I might have been holding back. And I went on a course once in Cranfield, and which was around sort of general management side of things, but there was a bit in there where there was like a group exercise, and I really held back. I was in the corner and I was doing a thing, and actually our group failed the challenge, and there was somebody in the room, well, actually all of the room went, why didn't you not step forward, because you could see in the debrief what you needed to do, and I didn't do it because I was kind of more comfortable. And so I think that that would be what I would say, is like, be ready to step forward and step up and embrace the discomfort, because that's going to come all the way through, and it still does. But, you know, that's not a bad thing. Just recognize it and don't kind of hide in the corner and, you know, be a team player, step up when you need to.
Sure. Yeah, brilliant. I love that. I love that. That's so powerful. Embrace that discomfort, but also I love the emphasis on just, connecting with your head, but also with your heart as well. And I feel I'm talk a lot about leading from the inside out. So just really being in tune with, what are the values of my heart? What are the beliefs that help me be at my best, our team be at our best, our organization deliver our purpose? So if you can connect with that, so head, heart, and guts, that helps you to lead in a healthy, holistic way. And there's far too much head out there and not enough of that heart connection. But we are human beings, and we've been given that heart and that gut for a reason, and it really enables us to lead in a healthy way. So thank you for sharing that, Wendy. And to all our listeners and viewers, I hope you enjoyed the conversation, got some great insights. I really enjoyed it, loved everywhere we went, and wish we could have chatted some more. So I'm sure we'll have some more conversations about what we've talked about today. But remember, listeners, viewers, that if you want to be a courageous and resilient leader, if you want to live life on purpose and with purpose, then it starts from the inside out. Have a great day, and see you all on the next show. And Wendy, thank you once again for joining me on the show.